There's nothing quite as special as the unbreakable and unique relationship between a mother and her daughter. Mothers want what's best for their children, and daughters look up to their mothers for inspiration and advice. The relationship may shift and change as time goes on, but one thing always remains the same: their unconditional love for each other. Unless, of course, you are Casey Anthony, who took the little girl who looked up to her and loved her unconditionally and threw her away like a piece of trash. Hi, guys. Welcome back to After Dark. I'm your host, Laura B. I'm sorry it took so long to get this episode out, but I fell down the Casey Anthony rabbit hole. I wanted to do a deep dive, and deep dive I did. There will also be multiple parts, and I will try my best to get them out as fast as possible so there isn't a long gap in between. So, with that said, let's jump right in. To understand, or at least attempt to understand, who Casey Anthony was and why she did the things she did, you must go back to the beginning. You have to look at her parents, her childhood, and the family dynamics in the Anthony home. So that's where we will start, at the beginning. Who were George Anthony and Cindy Plezia? Cindy Plezia was born June 5th, 1958, in Niles, Ohio, to father Alexander Plezia and mother Shirley Plezia. She had three older brothers. Cindy's parents were very strict, but with her being the only girl, they seemed to favor her more. Her brothers even gave her the nickname Princess. Their father, Alexander, was a stern Navy man, but when he was with his wife Shirley, it was obvious she wore the pants in the relationship. Shirley always worked several jobs at once when the kids were little, so they felt like they pretty much raised themselves. The boys always looked out for Cindy and made sure she was taken care of. Shirley was known to be verbally abusive to the kids, calling them names and putting them down over every little thing. One of Cindy's brothers said, quote, "You were supposed to fit her mold or else. She was a control freak. That's where Cindy learned it." End quote. The Plezias weren't financially well off in the early days. Eventually, Cindy's father did get a better job and they bought a nicer house in a good area, but that didn't change the way things were inside the home. Cindy got through her childhood and was a very good student in school. She went on to college and eventually became a registered nurse. This is how she would meet her future husband, George Anthony. He was at the hospital visiting his sick sister, and Cindy just happened to be her nurse. George Arthur Anthony was born on September 5th, 1951, in Warren, Ohio. I couldn't find a lot of information on George's childhood, nothing really about his parents, siblings, or even his education. He got married in 1972 to Terry R. Rosenberger. They dated throughout high school and got married when she found out she was pregnant. She had a miscarriage, however, and they never had any other kids together. When George was 22, he was working as a sheriff's deputy for Turnbull County in Ohio. A quote from Terry said, quote, "George was nothing if he wasn't wearing a uniform. It was his disguise. I think it hid a lot of his weaknesses." Another source said this about George Anthony, quote, "George wanted a mother figure. He wanted to be babied. He liked hanging around with kids more than adults because they were not a threat and no smarter than he was. He had a hard time connecting with people. He never let anyone get close to him or get to know him." After Terry's miscarriage, she and George tried to get pregnant again, but it never happened. She felt like George blamed her because he wanted to have a lot of kids and she couldn't give them to him. He made her feel like he only married her to have children. George didn't like confrontation, which seemed to be a trait he would later pass on to his daughter. He secretly filed for divorce from Terry. She didn't find out until a friend of hers saw it under court filings in the newspaper. He later backed out of the proceeding with the divorce after he was confronted. Terry, however, did file for divorce and she followed through with it. She said George was a pathological liar and had a gambling problem. George was still legally married when he met Cindy at the hospital and they started dating. She hid it from her family for a while. They got married 1 year and 1 day after his divorce from Terry was final on March 20th, 1981. A little over a year and a half later, George and Cindy welcomed their first child, Lee Anthony, who was born on November 2nd, 1982. He was named after George's father. Cindy loved material things and she had a habit of wanting to keep up with the Joneses. She liked things done her way and her way only. She would give you love and affection until you did something she didn't agree with. Then she would shut you out and make your life miserable. This is why people close to her hid things from her. Cindy was jealous that her sister in law lived a more comfortable and stable life financially than she did because her husband, George's brother, was running a successful car lot in Austintown, Ohio. Cindy wanted to be a stay at home mom along with her expensive lifestyle, but George didn't make enough money for her to do that. So she convinced him to quit his job at the sheriff's department and work at Anthony's Auto Sales and Service, which is his father's car lot. She thought he would bring in the big bucks just like his brother did. The problem with that was, however, that George had no people skills. He was miserable every day he went to the job, but he wanted to keep Cindy happy, so he stuck it out. His dad even paid for classes to teach him how to be a more personable and successful person. But they didn't help George. Just wasn't good around people and was very socially awkward. There was also no uniform to wear to the car lot, and as we learned from his ex-wife Terry, George only had confidence in himself when he was wearing one. It made him feel like a man. One of the business owners near the car lot, Tim Given, did describe George's appearance at work. He said, quote, George's hair was like a mannequin, not a hair out of place. He wore his clothes like a uniform, perfectly pressed. George and his father Lee did not get along. They were always fighting, sometimes even in front of customers. One time, the fighting turned physical and Lee pushed George. When George pushed him back, Lee went through a plate glass window and had to be hospitalized. Needless to say, George was fired after the incident. Many of the problems the Anthonys had started in 1985 when George took the job as a salesman. At one point, George was so depressed he took a whole bottle of aspirin and had to have his stomach pumped. Cindy's brother, Rick Plazia, thought it was because of how controlling Cindy was. This is one of the comments he made in an interview. Quote, we knew George was weak and weak-minded. He was being molded by Cindy into doing things he didn't want to do. She took his life. On March 19th, 1986, George and Cindy had their second child, a little girl they named Casey Marie Anthony. Casey was a spirited and very energetic child. She was full of personality and loved to make people smile. In 1987, George took out a second mortgage on their house and started his own car dealership. He named it quite the original name, George Anthony's Auto Sales. Must have taken him forever to come up with that. However, by 1989, the dealership went under and the Anthonys had to file for bankruptcy. Eventually, they lost their house to the bank. Cindy said that George handled the finances, so she was left in the dark about everything. After losing their house in 1989, they decided to move from Niles, Ohio to Orlando, Florida to get a fresh start. Cindy wanted to be near her parents who had moved to nearby Mount Dora, Florida a few years prior. On October 4th, 1989, they closed on their new home at 4937 Hope Spring Drive. This is the house that eventually would be flooded with media presence and be on everyone's TV in the country. Not long after the move to Florida, George got a job at Orlando Centralplex as a security guard, so he was back in uniform. That job was short lived, though. He then went to Snappy Car Rentals as a salesperson. We know that job didn't last long at all because George wasn't a good salesperson. He left this job and went to work at Orlando Centennial. He somehow managed to injure his knee at this job. After his knee healed, he started working at Falcon Termite and Pest Control. At the time of Kaylee's disappearance, he had just started a job at the Lexus dealership 3 days earlier. As you can see, George couldn't keep a job long enough to gain benefits and get raises, leaving Cindy the breadwinner of the family. Cindy got a job working as a nurse for an orthopedic surgeon and was making decent money. This made her feel in control of everything and everyone. She had no problem letting George know from time to time who paid the bills and who wore the pants in the relationship. Cindy seemed to be following in her mother's footsteps. By this time, Lee was 7 years old and Casey was 3 years old. Casey's childhood was relatively normal. There were no traumatic events to speak of or anything that would make her become the evil woman she turned out to be. George and Cindy's behaviors are what most likely influenced Casey to become a liar and a manipulator. Casey grew up to be a beautiful young woman with an active social media life. Casey did well all through grade school and middle school, and everyone liked her. Casey attended Colonial High School in Orlando. During her freshman and sophomore years, Casey did great. She had many friends and a boyfriend most of the time. Everyone said she was easy to get along with and was quite pleasant to be around. Her favorite subjects in school were PE and math. She excelled in her studies and won many awards. She also was involved in sports. She was part of the track, volleyball, and soccer teams. Although Casey was well liked and people seemed to gravitate towards her, it was also well known that you couldn't believe anything she said. She was known by many in her school as someone who told lies all the time. Big lies, little lies, she lied about anything and everything. She could twist things around until the other person thought that they were wrong and Casey was right. She knew how to play with people's heads. She also hated confrontation. One of her friends from high school made the following statement, quote, "If you confronted her on an issue, she wouldn't argue. She would simply not engage. If you wanted to call her out on something she had done or be angry with her, she would be nowhere to be found. She would make you feel like maybe you had misunderstood her." Casey and her brother Lee were always close, and he always stood up for her. He would tell people, quote, "Are you surprised? You know how she is. Why can't you just let her be?" There always seemed to be someone there to enable Casey, whether it was her parents, her brother, or friends. She never had to take accountability for her actions when she was a child. But the adult this behavior would create would be a narcissistic monster. She was able to flip her emotions on and off like a switch. She never had long friends. She kept them as long as it was beneficial to her. Then she would move on to her next victim. She could disassociate herself very easily. The one thing Casey didn't do was drink a lot or do drugs. She would have a drink on occasion, but that was it. This was probably due to her needing to be in control at all times. She didn't want to feel like she wasn't in control of any situation that she was in. Now we come to 2004, Casey's senior year of high school. By this time, Casey is doing a lot of stealing, lying, and hiding, and very little schoolwork. She didn't tell her parents, though, so they planned a huge graduation party for her. It was getting close to graduation, and Cindy noticed Casey didn't have her cap and gown yet. Casey first told her they hadn't come in yet. Then, just a couple of days before graduation, when Cindy realized it still hadn't arrived, she called the school herself. This is when she found out that Casey wasn't walking with her class at the ceremony, or graduating at all for that matter, because she was half a credit short. The show must go on in Cindy's eyes, however, and go on it did. They went ahead with the party, taking money and gifts from all the guests and not telling a soul that Casey did not graduate. Casey's grandparents were even in the audience and were really confused as to why Casey didn't walk across the stage. Cindy lied and said the school messed something up. Casey never did go back to finish school. Another example of great parenting by the Anthonys. Cindy's brother, Rick, made a comment regarding Cindy's behavior. He said, quote, Cindy didn't want any negative news coming out of her house. Cindy didn't make Casey take any accountability for her actions and taught her it was okay to lie to get what you want. Cindy and George wanted to protect their image at all costs. And what changed in Casey's junior year that made her start skipping class and not caring about her grades? People tend to believe it's because her parents' relationship was rocky around this time, and it looked like they may be heading for a divorce. Cindy even put George out of the house at one point until she found out she would have to pay him alimony. Then she let him come back home. This is what Cindy's mom, Shirley Plezia, had to say to her sister Mary about Cindy's situation at home. Quote, Cindy was doing fine, supporting the house, savings, etc., till George got them into debt with the online gambling, getting credit cards to cover the losses, then running up credit card bills. Cindy used a lot of her savings and took an equity loan on the house. So she has two big payments on the house. She used the rest of her 401k to play catch up on car loans and all of the other bills. She saw a lawyer before about the divorce before she took him back. George's lawyer said he could get half of the house, which Cindy had paid every penny on, and she would have to pay him alimony because she has supported him all these years. Cindy asked her lawyer if they could do that. He said yes, they could, because she had been the main supporter ever since they had come to Florida. Ain't that a bitch? She said there is no way that he was getting the house that she paid for. So she has to stay married, knowing she will never get ahead again. Even if she wanted to get an apartment and sell the house, he could still claim half of everything she has. That's why at 59 she's so depressed. All these years of working and between Casey and George, she is living payday to payday. After high school, Casey continued living with her parents. They provided her with a car to drive, a little white Pontiac Sunfire. She didn't work or pay any bills. Then in June 2004, Casey got a job at Universal Studios. She worked at the Event Imaging Studios kiosk. She basically was one of those annoying people you see at places like Disney World or Six Flags that stand at the front gate as you walk in and want to take a picture of your group, then talk you into buying it for an outrageous price. About 6 months after Casey started working there, in January 2005, she met someone. His name was Jesse Grund, and he worked at Universal also. He worked as an undercover security for loss prevention. Jesse said it was love at first sight. The relationship moved quickly and was quite intense. Within 2 weeks, they were already saying I love you to each other. He said his feelings for Casey were different than he had for anyone before. However, by March 2005, Jesse was feeling smothered by Casey. She was also too sensitive and insecure. She was constantly calling and texting him, wondering where he was at. Things got old really fast. They eventually broke up, but they stayed good friends. In June 2005, she even helped Jesse's little brother fill out job applications. Around this time is when Jesse's dad mentioned to his son that he thought Casey looked like she was pregnant. He asked Jesse if Casey had told him who the father was. Jesse, being a clueless teenage boy, told his dad he hadn't noticed Casey had been gaining weight, but she had told him she was, quote, retaining water. So Jesse dropped the subject. By this time, several other people had noticed that Casey looked pregnant, but she adamantly denied it. Cindy's brother, Casey's uncle Rick, was getting married in June 2005. His wedding was taking place in South Carolina. Cindy and Casey arrived the day before the wedding was to happen, and Rick noticed right away that his niece was pregnant. He said, quote, Casey was wearing a tight-fitting top and her belly was visibly extended with her navel protruding a good half an inch. When we got a minute to ourselves, I asked Cindy and George, "Do you have some news to tell me about Casey?" They replied with, "What are you talking about?" I said, she's pregnant." They looked at me like I was crazy. They said, "No way." I said, "She is pregnant. I would bet on it." They said they had asked her, and Casey said she would have to have sex to be pregnant. Casey and Cindy and George believed her. Everyone on my wife's side of the family said, "Who is the pregnant girl?" Even my wife's son and daughter asked. It was ridiculous. I told them to take her to a doctor. They finally did in July. She was nearly 8 months pregnant by then. Talk about telling a lie. That is when I saw the first evidence of what a pathological liar Casey was. End quote. Lee had also questioned his parents about Casey being pregnant, and they told him she had uterine fibroids. Were George and Cindy really that stupid, or were they choosing not to see what was in front of them? Just like with Casey's graduation, they would rather ignore something or lie about it rather than have Casey or anyone in the Anthony house look bad. It seemed Casey was flaunting her pregnancy, but then turning around and denying it. Casey had an effect on people to make them believe her. The apple doesn't seem to fall far from the tree in the Anthony house. Casey's parents didn't ask her right away who the father was. It was a few days after they found out she was pregnant that they brought the subject up. Casey just said she didn't want to think about it. She just wanted to focus on the baby. George said they didn't want to pressure her about who he was because stress could affect the baby. They decided to, quote, "just get through this thing and worry about the father later." George and Cindy had no clue she was even seeing anyone, and they had never even met Jesse Grunn. A lot of people said that George and Cindy didn't want the father around, and that's why they didn't pressure her about who he was. They didn't want another person to get in the way of their relationship with their granddaughter. They started being very possessive of Kaylee even before she was born. They would go to all of Casey's doctor appointments and be right in the room with her talking and asking the doctor questions, acting as if Casey wasn't even there. George wasn't even in the room when Kaylee was born, and I'll just say, he wasn't up by Casey's head holding her hand for support, if you know what I mean. In July, Casey called Jesse Grunn, who at the time was in a seminar for a new job. He didn't answer her call, but he did text message her and say that he couldn't answer his phone and for her to text him. Her text to him said, quote, "I'm pregnant and you're the father." At first, Jesse believed he was the father. He told Casey that since they were young and not even together, maybe they should lean towards adoption. Casey said no way. After a while, Jesse started having doubts. The timeline didn't seem to add up. They didn't start dating until the end of January, and Casey was due the beginning of August. When he would question Casey about it, she would get agitated and act offended. So he quit asking and just went along with it. But at the same time, she was making Jesse believe he was the father. She was telling other people that he was not the father. She told different people different names for who the father was. Sometimes it was one of her brother Lee's friends. Other times it was someone she worked at Universal with. One thing they all had in common was that she said the father had died in a car accident. Little Kaylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9th, 2005. Casey had switched her story up with her parents and told them that Jesse was the father. Jesse showed up at the hospital to meet his daughter, but the Anthonys were far from friendly. They wanted to take over and didn't want him in the way. Next week, we will talk about Casey and her life as a new mom and the days leading up to Kaylee's disappearance. Check out After Dark's Facebook page for photos from this episode. Until next time, take care and be safe.